And here's the best part. Derek grabbed the microphone mid-party, his laughter filling the decorated banquet hall. Anna actually thought the quarterly reports were projections, not actuals. She handed them to the whole board and said, he paused for dramatic effect, grinning at the crowd. She said, I think we can do better than this next year. The room erupted with laughter. 70 guests, champagne glasses raised, enjoying the story at my expense. This was our engagement party. The night was supposed to celebrate us, our future, the life we were building together. Instead, Derek stood at the front of the room, microphone in hand, retelling a private moment from a work meeting I'd attended months ago. A moment where I'd made an honest mistake. A moment I'd shared with him in confidence, embarrassed and vulnerable, trusting he would never use it against me. I felt heat rush to my face. The laughter pressed in from every direction. I forced my expression to stay neutral. Kept my chin up. Kept my shoulders straight. But then Derek looked directly at me across the room. He wasn't embarrassed for me. He wasn't checking if I was okay. He was smiling. Watching my reaction. Enjoying every second of it. And in that moment I understood something with absolute clarity. This wasn't a careless mistake. This was intentional. I raised my champagne glass and smiled back at him. Calm, steady, unbothered. The room shifted slightly, a few guests glancing between us, trying to read the moment. I walked to the front of the room, gently took the microphone from Derek's hand and cleared my throat. My turn, I said pleasantly. Laughter rippled through the crowd, the tension breaking. Derek is so good at reading numbers, I said, looking around the room with a warm smile. Honestly, that's what I admire most about him. His attention to detail. I paused. So I know he's looked very carefully at every decision we've made together. I clinked my glass against his. To a man who misses nothing. The guests applauded. Derek smiled, though something flickered behind his eyes. Confusion. A slight wariness. I handed back the microphone and returned to my seat. Inside I was anything but calm. My hands trembled under the table. My chest felt tight. But nobody in that room could see that. Because I had been practicing this kind of composure for months. Ever since the first time Derek had embarrassed me publicly and I'd cried in the bathroom afterward, I'd been building a different kind of response. And as I sat through the rest of the evening, smiling and chatting, I kept coming back to the same thought. This was the last time. That night, after the guests left and Derek fell asleep, I sat at the kitchen table with a glass of water and let myself think clearly. The quarterly reports incident hadn't been the beginning. I could trace it back much further now. A series of moments I'd individually dismissed but which together formed an unmistakable pattern. 8 months ago, Derek had suggested I stop asking questions at his firm's client dinners. You come across as inexperienced, he'd said gently. It's embarrassing for both of us. 6 months ago he'd mentioned that some of his colleagues found me too emotional about business decisions. I'd apologized, adjusted, made myself smaller. 4 months ago, I'd noticed unusual transfers from our shared savings account. Small amounts, irregular dates, explanations that felt slightly off. Restructuring, Derek had said. Investment reallocation. You wouldn't understand the mechanics. I hadn't pushed. I trusted him. 3 months ago he'd started attending late-night strategy meetings that never appeared on the shared calendar I'd always had access to before. When I mentioned it, he'd sighed with visible frustration. Anna, can we not do this? I need you to trust me. I'd stopped asking. But I hadn't stopped watching. And I hadn't stopped saving what I found. The folder had been growing for 10 weeks. The folder lived in a cloud account Derek had never seen. Password protected. Backed up to 2 separate services. I'd named it Wedding Planning because he never engaged with wedding details, considering that my domain. It was the one category guaranteed to keep him from clicking. Inside were months of careful documentation. Screenshots of bank transfers I'd photographed from statements left on his desk. Dates, amounts, destination account numbers I'd written down before the statements were filed away. Emails I'd seen open on his laptop during moments he'd stepped away. Forwarded to my personal account before he returned. Calendar appointments that had disappeared from our shared calendar but which I'd screenshotted before they vanished. Receipts from restaurants in neighborhoods he'd never mentioned visiting. Hotels with same-day checkout during weeknights he'd claimed to be at conferences. And one item that had taken me 3 weeks to fully understand. A business registration document showing Derek as co-founder of a company called Linden Strategies, registered 6 months ago. I'd found it in a folder inside his home office drawer while searching for a stapler. I'd photographed every page before putting it back exactly as I'd found it. Derek had no idea this folder existed. He'd been so confident in my trust that he'd never considered I might be quietly building a case. That confidence was his most critical mistake. 2 days after the engagement party, I started looking more carefully at the ring. It was beautiful. A cushion-cut diamond platinum band, exactly the style I'd mentioned once in passing. At the time I'd been touched that he'd remembered. That detail had seemed like evidence of love. Now I looked differently. I found the jeweler's receipt in Derek's email, which he'd left open on a shared computer. The ring had been purchased not from his personal account but from a business credit card. A card connected to an account under Linden Strategies. Why would a personal engagement ring be purchased through a business entity? I searched further. I found emails between Derek and someone named Victor, his apparent business partner, discussing the engagement announcement. Confirming the announcement creates the right impression for the Hartwell investors, Victor had written. They want to see stability. A solid personal life. An engaged man is more trustworthy than a single one. Derek's response, agreed. The timing works. The ring is covered under business development expenses. I'll file it accordingly. I read that email 4 times. The engagement ring was a business expense. Our engagement had been timed for investor perception. The party, the announcement, the photographs, all of it had served a financial strategy I'd never been told about. I hadn't just been humiliated at the engagement party. I'd been used as a prop in a business transaction. A week later I ran into Priya at the coffee shop near my office. Priya and I had been friendly for years through Derek's social circle, though never truly close. She sat down across from me with the slightly guilty expression of someone about to say something they've been holding back. "Anna," she began carefully, "I want you to know I told him this wasn't okay." I waited. "He's been telling people things about you," Priya said. "At his firm events, at the investors' dinners. He describes you as," she hesitated. "He calls you emotionally driven. Says you're not great with financial decisions. That you struggle with numbers." I kept my expression neutral. "What else?" "He's told at least 3 people that he handles all the financial decisions in your relationship because you can't be trusted to manage complex information." I took a sip of my coffee. "He told Victor, his business partner, that having you on the engagement paperwork was a risk because you're impulsive, but that it was a manageable risk." There was engagement paperwork. I was a risk to be managed. "Why are you telling me this?" I asked. Priya met my eyes. "Because I've watched him do this before. With someone else. And that person didn't see it coming until it was too late." She paused. "I think you're smarter than she was. I think you're already paying attention." He was right. I was. The name I kept finding was Sylvia. It appeared first on a restaurant receipt from 8 months ago. A private dining reservation for 2 under Derek W. plus Sylvia. That I'd found photographed in his old phone backup, which synced to the shared cloud account he'd forgotten I still had access to. Then it appeared in a calendar event labeled SB Quarterly Debrief, that had been on his personal calendar before he'd removed shared access. Then in a vendor email forwarded to his business account, the one he sometimes checked from the shared laptop, where Sylvia had written, "Confirm we're still on for Thursday. Don't forget what we discussed about the documentation." I cross-referenced the dates. The SB Quarterly Debriefs corresponded exactly with the weeknights Derek had cited late strategy meetings. Sylvia. I didn't know her last name yet. But I found her professional profile through the vendor email domain. Sylvia Brennan. A financial consultant whose firm had worked with Linden Strategies since its founding 6 months ago. The same month Derek had proposed to me. Her firm's website listed her specializations: investment documentation, asset structuring, and what the site called strategic personal positioning for high-net-worth professionals. I sat with that phrase for a long time. Strategic personal positioning. Derek had been professionally positioning himself, and I had been part of the positioning strategy. The pattern of control had been so gradual that each individual moment had felt almost reasonable. Derek had criticized my career choices gently, framed as concern. "I just think you're undervaluing yourself at that firm," he'd said 18 months ago. "You could be doing more. But you seem comfortable staying small." I'd tried harder to prove myself, spending less time with friends and more time working to meet the standard he kept subtly moving. He'd commented on my friendships dismissively. "Kara's nice, but she's not really in our world, is she? I sometimes think she holds you back socially." I'd pulled away from Kara, embarrassed by comparison. He'd questioned my instincts consistently. Every time I sensed something was wrong, he had a smooth explanation. Every time I raised a concern, he described my reaction as evidence of anxiety rather than evidence of a real problem. Over 18 months he had reshaped how I saw myself. Made me smaller. Made me quieter. Made me someone who apologized for noticing things. The woman who sat at that engagement party with her hands trembling under the table was a quieter, more uncertain version of who she'd been when she first met Derek. But the woman who'd been building that cloud folder for 10 weeks was something else entirely. She was waking up, remembering who she was, preparing carefully, and she was nowhere near finished. 3 weeks after the engagement party, Derek brought up the prenuptial agreement. "It's just standard practice," he said over dinner, casually, like he'd been thinking about it for days. "Given my firm's assets and the investment portfolio, it makes sense to have something clean on paper. Protects both of us." I nodded. "Of course. Send me the draft when it's ready." He looked slightly surprised that I'd agreed so easily. He'd clearly prepared for resistance. The draft arrived 4 days later via his lawyer. I read through it that same evening alone in my office, door closed. It was thorough. Favorably written for Derek as expected. His business assets were ring-fenced completely. My independent savings would be classified as joint property upon marriage. His pre-existing investments were protected. Mine were not. But there was a clause on page 14 that I read 3 times. It stated that in the event of proven infidelity or financial deception within the relationship, the party found responsible would forfeit all claims to any jointly accumulated assets, as well as any business interests established or grown during the relationship period. Derek's lawyer had clearly intended this clause to protect Derek from me. They'd assumed I might try to access his assets. They hadn't considered that the clause would work symmetrically. I emailed back within 24 hours. "The draft looks fine. I'm comfortable moving forward." Derek called within minutes, genuinely pleased. "Really? No changes?" "No changes," I confirmed. He had no idea what he'd just handed me. I met with a lawyer named Hannah 3 days later, at an office 40 minutes from my neighborhood. I paid the consultation fee in cash. Hannah reviewed the prenup draft, the financial documentation I'd compiled, and the business registration for Linden Strategies. She asked me careful questions. When had Derek started the business? When had the transfers from our joint account begun? What was the timeline of the engagement relative to the Hartwell investor meetings I'd found referenced in emails? I had answers for everything. Dates, amounts, documents. Hannah was quiet for a long moment after I finished. "The infidelity clause works in your favor," she said finally. "Assuming the relationship with Sylvia Brennan is what the documentation suggests, and assuming it can be established as ongoing during the engagement period, that clause triggers automatically." What does that mean practically? It means that any assets Derek acquired or grew with the assistance of funds connected to your joint accounts during the engagement period become contestable. Linden Strategies, for example, received capital from a source I'd want to trace carefully. She paused. It also means the engagement ring, purchased as a business expense through the company, could be argued to represent a misrepresentation of intent. I exhaled slowly. "How long have you been preparing for this?" Hannah asked. I thought about the folder. The 10 weeks of quiet documentation. The months of watching while appearing not to. "Long enough," I said. Linden Strategies was more than a side business. I understood that fully once Hannah helped me map the financial flows. Derek had been funneling money from 3 sources into the company's startup capital. His own investment account, which was legitimate. A loan from Victor that was expected. And a third source that was not. Over 6 months, $17,000 had moved from our joint savings account through a series of small transfers. Each transfer was under $1,000, spaced irregularly to avoid pattern detection. Each was labeled in our account as household expense or maintenance fee. None of it had been discussed with me. None of it had my authorization. I had signed the joint account agreement. My name was on it. Derek had used that access to fund a business I didn't know existed, without my knowledge or consent. Hannah explained the implications clearly. He used jointly held funds without authorization for a personal business venture. That's financial misconduct. And because your name is on the account, any regulatory attention the business attracts could also touch you. He told his business partner I was a manageable risk, I said. Hannah looked at me steadily. He was wrong. She outlined 3 options. I listened carefully, asked specific questions and took notes. By the time I left her office, I understood exactly what I was dealing with, exactly what I was entitled to, and exactly how to proceed. The affair hadn't started recently. I mapped the timeline carefully against my documentation, cross-referencing hotel receipts with calendar entries and email timestamps. The first evidence of Sylvia dated back 14 months. 2 months before Derek had told me he was falling in love with me. 4 months before he proposed at the rooftop restaurant I'd said was my favorite. The proposal I'd cried about. The moment I'd called my mother to describe in detail. The evening I'd told my friends was the happiest of my life. He had been with Sylvia then. He had been with Sylvia during our engagement party. During the toast where he'd made the room laugh at my expense. During every dinner where he'd told investors I was too emotional to be trusted with financial details. The ring he'd slid onto my finger while looking at me like I was everything. He'd bought it as a business expense the same week he'd met with Sylvia to plan the Hartwell investor strategy. I sat with that for a long time. Let myself feel the full weight of it. Then I closed the feeling away carefully, like placing something fragile in a box. Because feelings were mine. Evidence was what mattered now. And the evidence was thorough, time-stamped, and growing. For the next 6 weeks I became the fiancé Derek had always wanted me to be. Agreeable, quiet, deferential. I asked fewer questions. I attended his events and smiled at the right moments. I let him explain financial concepts I already understood without correcting him. When he suggested vendors for the wedding, I thanked him for his input. When he commented that the venue I'd chosen was a bit modest, I suggested we look at alternatives, letting him choose. When Victor joined us for dinner and mentioned Linden Strategies' upcoming funding round, I smiled politely and said I trusted Derek's judgment completely. Victor visibly relaxed. Derek looked quietly pleased. He interpreted my compliance as confirmation that everything was under control. That I was manageable. That the engagement strategy was working. What I was actually doing was giving him space to make more decisions. More moves. More documentation. Each time Derek acted unilaterally, he created another record. Each time he referenced the business in front of me as if I had no stake in it, he demonstrated his intent to exclude me from assets I had partially funded. Each dinner with Victor was another timestamp. Another witness to his confidence. Another piece of context that would matter later. Derek thought my silence was surrender. He had no idea my silence was a net, growing wider with every week that passed. By the 10th week after the engagement party, the paper trail was extensive enough that Hannah reviewed it and said 3 words. This is ready. The documentation showed a consistent, intentional pattern spanning 14 months. It was not a collection of coincidences or misunderstandings. It was a record of calculated behavior. It showed the Linden Strategies business formation, the $17,000 in unauthorized transfers from our joint account, the misclassification of the engagement ring as a business expense, and the emails describing me as a strategic asset and a manageable risk. It showed the affair with Sylvia Brennan with evidence spanning 14 months, overlapping completely with our relationship, our engagement, and the investor positioning strategy. It showed the prenup Derek had pushed for, drafted to protect him, containing a clause that instead exposed him. And it showed a pattern of public humiliation and private manipulation designed to undermine my confidence and professional credibility, which Hannah noted was relevant as context for the financial misconduct. He was very thorough in building what he thought was a protected position, Hannah said, reviewing the final summary. He is good at details, I agreed. Not good enough, she said. That was the last meeting before I moved from preparation to action. I'd spent 14 weeks quietly building everything I needed. Derek had spent the same 14 weeks believing he'd already won. The first crack appeared 4 weeks before the wedding date. Derek came home from work earlier than expected on a Tuesday, his expression tightly controlled but his jaw set in a way I recognized as contained anger. "Victor's pulling out of the funding round," he said, dropping his bag near the door. I looked up from the book I was reading. "I'm sorry to hear that. What happened?" He won't say specifically. Just that he got information that changed his risk assessment. Derek poured himself a drink and stood at the kitchen counter, thinking. Someone told him something. I kept my expression sympathetic. "That's frustrating. Do you have any idea what it was?" Derek looked at me for a moment. Something passed across his face, a brief flicker of suspicion that he seemed to dismiss. "No. It doesn't make sense. I had passed information to Victor through a careful channel. Not directly. I'd connected a mutual professional contact with certain publicly available business registration details that, when combined, raised legitimate questions about Linden Strategies' funding sources. I hadn't lied. I hadn't fabricated anything. I'd simply ensured the right information reached someone who would ask the right questions. Derek had always assumed I existed outside his business world. He'd never considered that I had my own professional network, my own contacts, my own ability to move carefully within the spaces he thought were his alone. Victor's withdrawal wasn't revenge. It was consequence. After Victor's pullout, something shifted in Derek. The confidence that had always animated him, the easy certainty that he was the smartest person managing every situation, started showing fractures. He drank more. Not dramatically but noticeably. An extra glass at dinner. A drink before events where he used to arrive sharp and focused. He became irritable in the mornings, snapping at small things. A misplaced phone. A slow coffee maker. Questions I asked that he'd previously answered smoothly now made him tighten. One evening he accused me of being checked out. "You seem distant lately," he said. "Like you're somewhere else." "I've been thinking about the wedding," I said simply. "There's a lot to organize." He accepted that. He wanted to accept it. He started scrutinizing my behavior, watching for signs I'd done something, said something, shifted in some way he could identify. But I gave him nothing to catch. I was careful, consistent, and exactly as he'd described me to his investors. Calm, manageable, not likely to act outside expected parameters. What he was actually seeing was someone who had already emotionally left. Who was still present physically but was gone in every way that mattered. Derek was looking for the moment I'd changed. He didn't realize the change had happened weeks ago, quietly and completely, while he'd been certain he had everything controlled. 3 weeks before the wedding date, I went to my final dress fitting. The boutique was small and unhurried. The seamstress worked quietly while I stood on the low platform before the mirror. 2 other consultants talked softly behind a curtain in the next fitting room. I wasn't listening until I heard Derek's name. The voice behind the curtain was a woman I didn't recognize, speaking to the boutique owner in a tone of casual confidence. "The whole Hartwell thing is apparently about optics. The engagement was, it was real to her obviously, but from the investor side it was designed to signal stability. A serious, committed man." The boutique owner murmured something I couldn't hear. "The girl seems lovely," the first voice continued. "She clearly has no idea. But that's the whole point, isn't it? She wasn't supposed to know." I stood completely still. The seamstress, pinning the hem, noticed my stillness and looked up briefly. I gave her a reassuring smile. She wasn't supposed to know. But I did know. I'd known for weeks. I'd built a folder around what I knew. I'd met with a lawyer about what I knew. I'd watched Victor withdraw his funding because of what I knew. And in 11 days, when I was supposed to walk down an aisle toward a man who saw me as a strategic asset, I was going to do something else entirely. The photographs appeared on a financial industry blog on a Thursday morning. I had nothing to do with them. They surfaced independently, posted by someone in the Hartwell investor circle who had apparently done their own research after Victor's withdrawal raised questions. The photos showed Derek and Sylvia at 3 different events over the past 8 months. Industry dinners. A conference in another city. A private event at a restaurant I recognized from an early receipt in my folder. The blog post asked pointed questions about the nature of their professional relationship and its implications for Linden Strategies' investor disclosures. My phone rang within an hour. Derek's voice was controlled but strained. "Have you seen the thing online?" "I just saw it," I said honestly. It's completely distorted. Sylvia is a business consultant. The relationship is entirely professional. Of course, I said. I need to know you believe me. I paused just long enough to be convincing. I'm sure there's an explanation. What I didn't tell him was that the photographs aligned precisely with documentation I'd held for weeks. That the dates matched hotel receipts and calendar entries in my cloud folder. That the images weren't creating a story, they were confirming one I already knew completely. Derek spent that entire day making phone calls, managing responses, drafting statements. He was very busy. Too busy to notice that I was also making calls. The prenup clause activated on a Tuesday. Hannah had prepared the formal notification, supported by the evidence we'd compiled. The infidelity documentation was clear and time-stamped. The financial deception, unauthorized transfers, business expense misclassification, undisclosed use of joint funds, was equally documented. Derek received the notification through his lawyer on a morning I made sure I wasn't home. I was having coffee with my mother when his first message came through. I read it and put my phone face down. Hannah called at noon. He's asked for 48 hours to respond. His lawyer is apparently trying to argue the infidelity clause was meant to be directional, not bilateral. Meaning they thought it only protected him, I said. Exactly. They're arguing the intent was asset protection against a potentially impulsive partner. Hannah's voice carried the careful neutrality of someone not quite suppressing amusement. Unfortunately for them, the clause doesn't specify direction. It applies symmetrically. What are his options? He can contest, which opens discovery. Full financial disclosure. Both sides. She paused. Or he can negotiate. What does discovery look like for Linden Strategies if its funding sources are examined? Uncomfortable, Hannah said. Given the joint account transfers, the business expense classifications, and the timing relative to investor discussions, uncomfortable is an understatement. Derek had pushed for a prenup to protect himself. He had not considered even once that I might have read it more carefully than he had. Derek's first public response was exactly what I had expected. He told mutual friends that I'd become erratic. That wedding pressure had caused instability. That he was worried about me and had tried privately to address concerns before I'd escalated things through lawyers. He told one of his firm colleagues that I'd misunderstood the business arrangements because I lacked the financial literacy to interpret them correctly. He told Victor, who had already withdrawn, that I'd been manipulated by someone feeding me false information, implying that I was a victim of outside interference rather than someone who had drawn her own accurate conclusions. Every statement assumed the same thing, that I was reactive, emotional, and being managed by forces I didn't understand. None of it was delivered to me directly. He communicated through the social network, shaping perception before I could respond. What he didn't know was that I wasn't going to respond to any of it. Not to friends. Not to colleagues. Not publicly. Hannah's office was handling every communication. Formal, documented, and precise. Every message he tried to manage socially was met with silence from me and a legal letter from Hannah. The contrast between his escalating explanations and my complete public composure told its own story. And people were beginning to notice which side was doing all the talking. I returned the ring on a Wednesday afternoon. Not by mail. Not through lawyers. In person because I wanted to look him in the eyes for this particular moment. We met at a coffee shop I had chosen. Neutral, public, small enough that voices had to remain controlled. Derek arrived looking tired. The confidence that had animated him at our engagement party, that easy, certain authority, was diminished. He looked like someone who had been managing damage for 2 weeks and was beginning to understand the damage wasn't manageable. I sat down across from him and placed the ring box on the table between us. Then I placed a folder beside it. "What's that?" he asked. "Copies," I said. "Everything Hannah's office is working with. I thought you should have your own set." He didn't touch the folder. "Anna," he began. "I don't need an explanation," I said calmly. "I'm not here for a conversation about what happened or why. I just wanted to do this in person." He looked at the ring box for a long moment. "The business," he said finally. "You understand this complicates." "Hannah will be in touch about the business," I said. "That's her domain." I stood, picked up my bag and looked at him one final time. He looked like a man who had just understood fully and completely that the person across from him had never been what he'd assumed. I walked out without looking back. The collapse didn't happen dramatically. It happened the way most things collapse. Gradually, then suddenly, then completely. Investors who had connected with Derek through the Hartwell network began quietly reassessing. The blog post had raised questions. The prenup clause notification had reached people who talked. The Victor withdrawal had already started conversations. I didn't spread information. I didn't need to. Derek had already spread it himself by operating recklessly under the assumption that I would never look closely enough to find it. His firm placed him on administrative leave within 2 weeks of the prenup notification. The internal review centered on the Linden Strategies funding sources and their relationship to client accounts. Sylvia Brennan's consulting firm quietly severed its relationship with Linden Strategies. Her professional profile was updated to remove the association. The friends who had surrounded Derek at our engagement party, who had laughed at his story about the quarterly reports, who had comforted him as if he were the one navigating difficulty, began to recede. Not publicly, not with statements. They simply became less present. I received careful, quiet messages from some of them. Apologies that didn't quite name what they were apologizing for. Acknowledgments that things were more complicated than they'd realized. I responded to most with simple grace. I had no interest in extended discussions about who had known what and when. I was already looking forward. 3 weeks after returning the ring, Derek sent a message through a mutual friend asking if I would be willing to speak privately. He wanted, the message said, to clarify some things, and potentially reach an understanding outside of legal proceedings. He believed there was room for a conversation that would serve both our interests. I read the message, forwarded it to Hannah, and asked her to acknowledge receipt through formal channels. The following day I received something different. A message from his lawyer suggesting that certain legal claims might be reconsidered if I agreed to sign a non-disclosure agreement about the specifics of our engagement period. I called Hannah. "He wants silence," she said. "He's hoping that settling quietly contains the story. No disclosure means his version can still be the one people remember. What does he have to offer that's worth silence?" I asked. Hannah's answer was thorough. We discussed it carefully. Then I told her my position. I wasn't interested in his offer. I wasn't interested in silence. But I also wasn't interested in extended legal combat. "Tell his lawyer that I have no intention of discussing private matters publicly," Hannah said on my behalf. "And that the legal matters will proceed according to the documentation already submitted." Derek had assumed that if he offered enough, I would accept quiet. He still didn't understand that I wasn't doing this for noise. I was doing it because I was worth more than the role he'd cast me in. 8 months after the engagement party, my life looked completely different. I had moved into an apartment I'd chosen entirely alone. Smaller than the home Derek and I had been planning to share, but filled with things that were mine. Books I'd recollected. Art I'd bought without consulting anyone. A kitchen organized for how I actually cooked. My career had accelerated. Freed from the constant low-level work of managing Derek's perception of me, I had found myself thinking more clearly, working more sharply, taking on projects I'd previously hesitated over because he'd made me doubt whether I was ready. I had called Kara 2 weeks after the engagement ended. We'd met for dinner and I'd told her everything. She had listened without interrupting, and when I finished she had said, "I knew something was wrong. I just didn't know if you could see it yet." I had my mother. I had Kara. I had Hannah, who had concluded the legal proceedings firmly and thoroughly. I had colleagues who respected the person I'd been quietly becoming throughout a year that had nearly dismantled me. Priya had texted once to ask how I was doing. I'd told her honestly, better than I'd expected. She'd replied, "I'm glad you listened to your instincts." I had. Eventually. The folder I'd built in secret, the one labeled wedding planning, had been closed and archived. I didn't need it anymore. 7 months after the legal proceedings concluded, I attended an industry event hosted by a firm I'd begun consulting for. It was formal, well-attended, the kind of gathering where careers were consolidated and reputations were confirmed. I was there because I'd been asked to speak. A 15-minute slot about documentation practices in professional transitions. A small thing but mine. I saw Derek from across the room before he saw me. He was standing near the edge of the gathering, a drink in hand, watching the crowd. His administrative leave had ended without reinstatement. Lyndon's strategies had been quietly dissolved after the funding irregularities review. He was, I had heard, consulting independently now. Smaller scale, carefully positioned away from the circles where his story was known. He looked like someone who had learned to make himself less visible. When he finally noticed me, I was in conversation with a group of colleagues, laughing at something someone had said. I was relaxed, confident, occupying space in the way I'd forgotten how to do when I'd been with him. Our eyes met briefly across the room. I didn't look away first. I didn't look away at all. I simply turned back to my conversation, finished my thought, and let him fade into the background of an evening that was mine. He had humiliated me at a party once. He had used my name, my trust, and my money to build something he thought I'd never find. But I had found everything. Documented everything. Protected everything. And in doing so, I had reclaimed the most important thing of all. The clear, certain knowledge of exactly who I was. That was the secret that had left him speechless. Not the folder. Not the lawyer. Not the prenup clause. Just me. Fully awake. And completely free.